For those of you who aren't familiar with the term one-shot, think of a pilot episode for a graphic novel or a manga series. Way to show the main story and the characters without getting too much into it. See, a one-shot is only around a chapter's length, so like 20 to 30 pages instead of 100 or plus more if you wanted to make a full story and have no one be interested. A one-shot is a good way to get your name out there. It's kind of how most comics start. Today I'm compiling a bunch of my brainstorming ideas as to what this one-shot would be. And this is a project titled Call of the Breeze, by the way. This is technically my third sketchbook tour, but my second episode of Call of the Breeze. This is a one-shot, so it's more finished and compiled than the other sketchbook tour, which is basically like the opening to the whole story. So if you want to get more of the background, or if you're just interested in the art and the story, check that video out as well. Finally, let's get into it. Starting off, I made a background template and added some paper texture as well as some page dividers. I wanted to keep it simple, but also have more of an antique traditional sketchbook feel. I don't know, I don't really like drawing on a white page. I feel like it's very boring and it's hard to get inspired sometimes. On the left, we have our protagonist of the story, Tegan Underwood. And on the right is her brother, known as Flint. Tegan has a strong bond with the Ember Ladybug. She found this statue along the cloud shoreline. For years, she's excelled at fire magic and can even fly using fire propelled from her feet. In a world full of mountaintops that peak above the clouds, I think it's a really important ability to fly. Tegan is very stubborn and lazy, while her brother is wild and kind. He tends to drag her out of the house, and she tends to do something that causes a scene, and they tend to get in trouble a lot. If you know anything about astrology, think of fire and an air sign together. They both have a lot of passion, but the fire sign's more stuck in their own ways, while the air sign's very malleable and tends to go with the flow. Like I mentioned before, Tegan gets her magic from the Ember Ladybug. The Ember Ladybug is a totem, or a statue carved by the spirit of coral. Meditating with this crystal statue, she can communicate with the spirit, and the spirit teaches her magic and other strange abilities. The coral spirit is a very well-known deity. She has many other totems and has many followers, but most live on Mount Coral or Downpour Peak. Downpour Peak is a small military base that worships both coral and bloodstone. Keeping in mind the alchemical practice of one is all and all is one, this world is really connected. In fact, that each spirit creates life of the creatures by carving a statue out of their own gemstone. And it's the life force of my world and how people gain magic and abilities by meditating and talking with the spirit. I mentioned before that Downpour Peak was a military base, and military isn't the correct term for them. In a world in the sky, the military is known as the Angels. They're people who basically fly around and protect innocent and all that fun stuff, or whatever they want you to believe. I think I want there to be a lot of corruption, but not too much. I don't know, it's something that I'm really figuring out still. Anyways, Flint grew up on Downpour Peak as a child. See, his dad was a very successful angel, but he grew up really alone. His dad was never around, constantly traveling the skies, defeating evil and slaying monsters, the normal absent dad things. Tegan's mom was also an angel, so she was gone a lot too. Tegan never really knew her dad, so her and Flint got along because she was also sent off to Downpour Peak. Both Tegan and Flint had absent parents, but luckily Tegan had a super cool uncle that took them both in and adopted them. Downpour Peak, where the two grew up, there was a lot of temples for coral and bloodstone. So Tegan, respectively, found a lot of coral temples where she learned fire magic, and Flint stumbled into the bloodstone ones where he learned storm magic. So he can summon clouds, he can call upon rain and storms and just basically anything like that. After a few years on the mountain peak, Rowan stepped up and adopted his little niece and her buddy. They now live on a remote mountaintop called Mount Amber. This is where the story begins. Both Flint and Tegan hate it there. There's nothing fun or anything to do. There's not even a city or a village for that matter. It's just Rowan's guild, and that's something that Tegan refuses to join. Seriously, Rowan has tried again and again to get his niece to join his guild. But yet every time Tegan declines and said it's too much work. See, Flint joins his uncle's guild to make him happy. He's been pretty successful on the odd jobs he's come across and has made a name for himself in the guild. After time and time of begging and begging, Tegan finally caved and said she would join his guild. But the day of her induction ceremony into his guild, she is nowhere to be found. This is the opening to the one-shot. Is her about to be honored into the guild, but she's not there to accept the guild mark. So, Rowan and a group of others decide to go looking for her. Flint is part of this group. Flint goes off on his own, and he's the only one who knows where Tegan could run off to. So, after checking a few small hideaways, he finally finds her relaxing in her hammock. Flint tells Tegan about how most of the guild is out looking for her, and she really can't get out of this one. She made a promise to her uncle, even if it was a hollow one, after time and time of relentless begging. But once again, Tegan finds a way to wiggle and squirm past responsibility. Tegan knows of a temple nearby. If they ask to enter the temple's dungeon, they will be transported into a separate space dimension. A dungeon is a spiritual realm made by the spirit to test their followers. Think the trials in the Breath of the Wild. Just small shrines that show up and you can enter and go through a few tests and those types of things. In every dungeon, there are 2 rooms followed by 1 boss room. After solving the first 2 rooms' puzzles and defeating the boss, the spirit of the temple shows themselves and will teleport you out of the temple. The thing is they can teleport you to any temple that they're associated with around the world. This would be a method of fast travel if this were a video game. Being able to go on dungeon runs and then teleporting wherever you can based on the dungeon you ran into. I promise that'll make a lot more sense once the story's explained more. It is a little confusing just explaining a dungeon in no context of anything, just the dungeon as a whole. Entering the first room of the dungeon, the 2 fall from the sky into a void. After falling for a long time, they land on a cloud. This cloud has wooden planks and carpets that you can walk on, but if you step on the cloud, or if you're Tegan and try to use fire to propel yourself, you will fall and be brought back to the temple's entrance on Mount Amber. So the goal of this room isn't really a puzzle, more of make it to the door. With limited space to walk on, it's going to be tricky to maneuver, as is, but there are a few monsters there to make things extra fun. With this being a Bloodstone temple, and Bloodstone being the very spirit that Flint works with, he is able to tame a bubbleback whale who helps him by giving him a lift to the door. After Flint tames the creature, and makes it to the second room, it is a battle royale. They have to fight off a giant mob of cloud kangaroos. Following the trend of the first room, where if you step on the cloud you'll fall right through, there are pillars around, leaving you spaces to jump and move around. This form of puzzle, quote-unquote, is right up Tegan's alley. She prefers combat over figuring out a puzzle any day. After every last cloud dragon is defeated, the door to the boss room opens. The boss is known as the Rattlestorm Dragon. When it shakes its giant tail, a rattle sound is made that summons storms and calls upon rain. As well as this dragon being adorable, he's quite the threat. Which is exactly why the battle would be a perfect example and display of how I draw combat. It gives people some action and some cool fight scenes, instead of dialogue and world building for 3 chapters until the action begins. See, that's the beautiful part of a one-shot, is that it's really short, so you have to not over-explain and just make it really simple. I absolutely loved the Rattlestorm Dragon's design and his big derpy cloud ears. So much, in fact, that I accidentally deleted the line art from my first sketch, and I didn't notice until it was too late to try and get it back. So I had to redo it. Anyways, Tegan and Flint are rewarded for completing the dungeon. Tegan asks the spirit to be teleported anywhere but here. She hates Mount Amber, and she honestly decided that running away from home was easier than coming back to her uncle. Bloodstone agrees to Tegan's request, but before they are sent off to who knows where, he talks to Flint on how impressed he is. See, like I mentioned before, Flint studied under Bloodstone and followed him since he was a kid, so Bloodstone has seen how much he's grown. He allows him to keep the boss's soul and tells him if he brings the soul to a blacksmith, that the blacksmith can sharpen and forge a weapon, a powerful weapon that doesn't crack or break. This is a weapon that the Bloodstone spirit uses himself. And with that being said, that's the end of the one-shot. I feel like it would wrap up pretty nicely. I feel like the gang successfully gets away from their uncle, and it leaves a lot to be continued and pick up at the same time, which is the point of a one-shot. You know, this is a whole big story, and it's so hard to put it all in one chapter, but I feel like this mainly covers the gist, where Tegan runs away from home and goes on a grand adventure. Now it's time to attempt the script. This is the hardest part for me, and I fail almost every time at this. So I'm desperately looking for a writer. So if you are inspired by my art and the vague story I've come up with, please help me iron out a script and let's make this project a finished comic together. As always, if you enjoyed this video, subscribe for more art and world building. Don't forget to leave a like, and like I said, I do want to hear what you think should happen next. I mean, there's so much to be talked about. I mean, Rowan's gotta figure out what Tegan's up to eventually. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how that would all play out. Thank you again for watching, and have a good one. Stay safe.